I actually want to begin with an incident that happened 3 years ago tomorrow. It began on the morning of March 31st, 2004, 9:30 a.m. in the city of Fallujah, Iraq. When the 4 Americans rolled into Fallujah in their 2 Pajero jeeps, the Iraqi Mujahideen in the city of mosques were waiting for them. The main drag that cuts through the city is lined with restaurants, cafes, souks, and on ordinary days, throngs of people mill around. But early that morning, a small group of masked men had detonated an explosive device clearing the streets and causing shopkeepers to shutter their stores. From the moment the convoy of Americans entered the city limits, the men stood out, driving vehicles known widely in Iraq as bullet magnets and sporting wraparound sunglasses and Tom Cruise haircuts. Shortly after they entered Fallujah, the jeeps began to slow. To their right were shops and markets, to the left open space. They'd hit some sort of a roadblock. As the vehicles came to a standstill, a grenade was hurled at the rear jeep, quickly followed by the rip of machine gun fire. Bullets tore through the side of the unarmored rear Pajero like salt through ice, fatally wounding the 2 men inside. As the blood gushed from them, masked gunmen moved in on the jeeps, unloading cartridges of ammo and pounding their way through the windshield. Chants of Allahu Akbar, God is great, filled the air. Soon, more than a dozen young men who'd been hanging out in front of a local kebab shop joined in the frenzy. By the time the rear jeep was shot up, the Americans in the lead vehicle realized that an ambush was underway. They tried to flee, but it was too late. The crowd quickly swelled to more than 300 people as the original attackers faded into the side streets of Fallujah. The jeeps were soon engulfed in flames. The scorched bodies of the Americans were pulled out, and men and boys literally tore them apart, limb from limb. In front of the TV cameras, a young man held a small sign emblazoned with a skull and a crossbones that declared in English, "Fallujah is the graveyard of the Americans." The mob hung the charred, lifeless remains of the Americans from a bridge over the Euphrates, where they would remain for hours, forming an eerily iconic image that was seen on television screens throughout the world. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., President Bush was on the campaign trail, speaking at a fundraiser dinner. "This collection of killers is trying to shake our will," the president told his supporters. "America will never be intimidated by thugs and assassins. We are aggressively striking the terrorists in Iraq. We will defeat them there so we do not have to face them in our own country." The next morning, Americans woke up to news of the gruesome killings. "Iraqi mob mutilates 4 American civilians," was a typical newspaper headline. Somalia was frequently invoked, referring to the incident in October of 1993 when rebels in Mogadishu shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters, killed 18 American soldiers, and dragged some of them through the streets, prompting the Clinton administration to withdraw its forces. But unlike Somalia, the men killed in Fallujah were not members of the active U.S. military, nor were they civilians, as many news outlets reported. They were highly trained private soldiers sent to Iraq by a secretive mercenary army based in the wilderness of North Carolina, its name Blackwater, USA. For many people, that ambush was the first that they'd ever heard of armed private soldiers operating in Iraq, or in any war zone for that matter. They were on the payroll of the US government, and yet they aren't counted as part of the occupation force, at least not officially. What happened after that should be well known to everyone, but because of the embedded coverage, it isn't. The Bush administration ordered an all-out revenge attack on the city of Fallujah. Over the course of several days, they carried out 37,000 airstrikes against the city of 350,000 people. They destroyed 19,000 of Fallujah's 39,000 buildings, killed hundreds of civilians, forced thousands upon thousands from their home. They bombed the city's main power plant at the beginning of the operations, effectively blacking out the city and leaving residents with no power. And so for the most part, Fallujahans were left in utter darkness. And the U.S. psychological operations teams arrived on the ground in the early stages of the operation, the cleanup operation, as they referred to it. And these PSYOPs teams tried to think of the filthiest insults that they could have translated into Arabic and screamed over loudspeakers. When Iraqis would emerge from indoors to fire their weapons, the Marines would gun them down. The Marines began referring to the city as Lala Fallujah, and the eerie soundtrack was music like Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses or Hell's Bells by AC/DC. During the siege, a Cobra attack helicopter launched a Hellfire missile at a mosque hitting the base of the minaret. Fallujah, a city I've been to many times, is known as the city of mosques. That was followed by an F-16 dropping a 500-pound bomb on the compound which the US claimed was housing insurgents. Within days, hundreds of people had been killed, and humanitarian groups reported forces firing at ambulances, attempting to rescue the wounded or to retrieve the dead. A stench had overtaken the city of Fallujah, and independent reporter Dar Jamail, who may be familiar to people here, a heroic, unembedded journalist who reports regularly on Democracy Now! And for many independent media outlets, he made it inside the city and reported that residents had responded to the pileup of corpses in the streets by turning 2 football fields into mass graves. And while US media outlets reported almost exclusively from the vantage point of US forces, and they spoke of fierce gun battles between Saddam Hussein's supporters and al-Qaeda militants inside of the city of Fallujah, the rest of the world saw the massacre that was unfolding. In many ways, that week, sparked by the deaths of 4 mercenaries, was the week that the war turned, the week that the anti-occupation resistance exploded. And it had been building for about a year, because one of the first things that Paul Bremer did, Bush's man in Baghdad, the viceroy, the proconsul, was to implement something they called de-Baathification, modeled after denazification. As a result of Paul Bremer's de-Baathification policies, teachers were fired, doctors were fired, lawyers were fired, government workers were fired. The entire civil structure of Iraq, which had been a modern, secular nation, was destroyed. But also, in addition to all of the civil society people that were fired because they were affiliated in some way with the Ba'ath Party, Paul Bremer ordered the firing of 250,000 Iraqi soldiers, effectively sending them into the ranks of the anti-occupation resistance. And so we had this moment where 4 American mercenaries go into the middle of a city that the US military wouldn't even enter. They go into that city in unarmored vehicles. They go into that city short 2 men. They go into a city that their own contract that they were working under with Blackwater recognized was a no-go zone, a dangerous city for anyone to be, not to mention Americans looking very much like Americans. And the company that sent them there, Blackwater USA, when that incident happened, they set out to make a killing off the killings. Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater USA, I'm going to talk about his story in a moment, picked up the phone and called his old friend, Paul Behrens. Paul Behrens was a senior partner at the Alexander Strategy Group. The Alexander Strategy Group was one of the most powerful K Street lobbying firms in the country at the time, staffed and founded by former senior staffers of then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay. It was also the firm that once employed Jack Abramoff. And with his Alexander Strategy Group operatives steering him, Eric Prince and other Blackwater executives found themselves sitting down with the men who literally ran both the House of Representatives and the Senate. These killings happened on March 31st, 2004. By June of 2004, Blackwater had been called our silent partner in the war on terror by Senator John Warner and was handed one of the most lucrative government contracts in Iraq, a $320 million contract to provide so-called security services for the US State Department. I just got back a Freedom of Information Act request that I had filed some months ago, and I determined that Blackwater has been paid since June of 2004 on that contract $750 million, $750 million just by the US State Department. That doesn't count its work for the military, that doesn't count its work for intelligence agencies, that doesn't count its work for private war contractors operating in Iraq. And so this company, Blackwater, didn't even exist a decade ago. It was 5,000 acres on the vast Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina. In fact, people ask me, well, the name Blackwater, it's so ominous. Where does it come from? It must be from covert ops or something having to do with special forces. It actually, ironically, is a tip of the hat to the dark waters of the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina. So 10 years ago, Blackwater was little more than this open space and the personal fortune of its founder. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of this company because I believe firmly that the story of Blackwater embodies everything that President Eisenhower warned against in his 1961 farewell address when he warned of the rise of unchecked power under the military-industrial complex.